Christ is risen. Before we jump into this next section on Luther's birth and childhood, any questions, any follow-up from last week talking about the kind of forerunners of the Reformation, John Huss or Wycliffe? Nothing burning question, or even not, you're just curious? Anything? All right. I'm hoping that at least some of what we go through in this next stretch when we're talking about Luther's life, I'm hoping some of it's familiar to you, but if not, great. I mean, great that we can look at this. I guess I don't know, like how, I know when I was growing up in grade school, this was a pretty regular thing, so we got to know the major events in Luther's life, or we might just have heard it so many times, but if not, here it is. So we're going to start at the beginning. Start with Luther's parents. So I've got an outline. You can see that with a few quotes there. I'll start with Luther's parents, Hans and Margaret Luther. They, although Luther called his mother Hannah sometimes, they're from this area by Eisenach. I think both of them. It's not entirely sure. I was reading biographies, and they're not even sure which family his mother was from, whether she was a Lindemann or a Ziegler. One of them was from Eisenach, more close to Eisenach, and one was from Merowan. Luther had commented, but I think most guys say this, that he had married up above his class or something. Whether that was she was from a more wealthy family. His family was a group, so you see that term there under A1, Erbsensleute. That was the type of kind of class that his family was in. Literally, that means earth tax people. What it was a class of peasants that only paid tax on the land that they farmed, and not on their people. They were free peasants. And so that gave him some mobility. So the family had an estate around in this region down here near Eisenach in Thuringia, near, like, kind of next to the forest there. When you see his name spelled, like, it's all over the map, different ways you can see the different ways that it was spelled there. Luther even spells it differently. It's very common for students at this age to always Latinize their name, or even, what's the word for making it into Greek? There's a version where he changes it into Greek. His name, that was very common. Hans Luther was the oldest of 4 sons. And you see the names there. I think it's funny that they named the oldest one Gross Hans and then the next one Klein Hans, which is Big Hans and Little Hans. But yeah, but as the oldest in this, he couldn't inherit the property. He couldn't inherit the farm. The oldest never could, because I guess it makes sense a little bit that the youngest one would inherit, because he'd be the last one there. It's like the oldest one could leave, and so he does, and that's why he ends up going up to Eisleben. I guess we don't know when they were married, but he goes in kind of out of farming into mining. And you can see the note there. I put this as kind of gets ahead, but we don't know exactly I don't know think of him as a miner, like a just simple laborer, but like at least by 1501, he's owning mines or leasing them, running them. He gets to do quite well for himself. Owned by 1501, says he owned 6 mines and 2 smelters. He was on the city council in Mansfeld, so he was ended up being pretty prosperous there. Just to note, we'll mention it probably later on, but just note the years of his parents' deaths in 1530 and 1531. Note that 1530 date. That's when the Augsburg Confession was presented, so the Diet of Augsburg was going on. When Luther's father died, that's when Luther was, the Diet of Augsburg was going on, and Luther was he couldn't go there because he couldn't leave the territory safely. And so he was stuck at the Coburg Castle and getting messages back and forth while the Diet of Augsburg was going on. Well, one of the messages that he gets, not from Augsburg, from home, was that his father died. And this story goes that he wept for, I don't know, so hard that he made himself sick. But 1530. You have there a quote from Luther in a letter. I had come across this, a letter to George Spalatin. I don't know what the context of why he was telling him where he came from, but this is Luther himself describing where he comes from. Born in Eisleben, baptized there at St. Peter's Church. I don't remember this. It was a day old. Of course you don't remember it. But I believe my parents and the folks at home. There is some question about the year of his birth. There's some discrepancies. I think that the year that we have, I forget now where that comes from. I know his mother said a date, but she wasn't entirely sure which year that was, which happens in old records. They were confident about the day that he was born. We'll get to that in a little bit. But the year, it could have been a year earlier or later or something like that. But 1483 is probably certain. So Luther is born in Eisleben. So again, he moves here to kind of go into the mining industry. It's a lot of mines. And I don't know if you can see that in this painting. Not really. It's hilly farmland, but there's pretty rich. I should know what they were mining. If it was copper, I should know that. I should have read that. So I'm sure I did. But what they mined there. Born on November 10th, 1483, and then baptized the next day on St. Martin's Day. And as was common, so why baptized right away? One, you'll see it was kind of somewhat convenient, but also child mortality, I think I have a note here at this time, about 60% mortality rate. So you didn't, that's one reason not to sit around. Also because it's kind of sort of important, baptism is. And so we wouldn't want to wait around either. We might not have to go exactly the next day, but we might also not live just down the street from the church. So this is, I don't know when this drawing or painting is from, but it does show the house. So the house that he was born in, which doesn't stand there now, I'll show you a modern picture. And then the church was just up the road. There. So this is what it looks like today, I guess. So the house isn't there. And I think it wasn't that long ago that the house, I read it, I'm sure, but there's a lot of things I read this week about houses buildings being torn down and which ones are original, which ones aren't. But you can see there it says birth house of Martin Luther here. But the foundation, this is where the house was, and that's why, so they've got this little garden thing there. I don't know if you're wondering what the Luther Armenschule is. I don't know. That's what, I tried to find that out. Luther Armenschule means poor school, the school for the poor. Why it's got Luther's name on it, I don't know the details. I tried to look even on Google Maps. You can go Street View down here and see what it looks like today. I tried to see if I could find a sign on the door, but I couldn't find one for this. But then you've got a lot of museums. And so this building right next to it, which probably wasn't the house that he was born in, but right next to it is what they have as a museum for Luther's. All these cities, a number of cities, I don't know how many there are in Germany, that if officially they were renamed Lutherstadt, Eisleben, Lutherstadt, Wittenberg, that they're named as cities prominent in Luther's life. And so, as the custom, you'd receive your Christian name, oftentimes given the name of the saint on which that day was. And so Luther gets the name Martin after Martin of Tours. That's his feast day. A soldier on November 11th. But then within it, so he's baptized the next day. The church, I can't remember exactly if this church is still the one, but the stone, this is the stone that was used at his baptism. It was taken out of service and then put back in. The church today, the modern church there, I mean, it's still the same structure, but It's got like a font in the floor. It looks like a little hot tub, but maybe this far around in the floor, but then this they put this back in the church, and so but this it's got engraving in there which says Martin Luther, so that would have obviously been done later. They didn't do that for his baptism, but apparently the stone. Then within a year they moved from Eisleben to Mansfeld. Those are very close to each other. Mansfeld, there's a castle overlooking the city. This, I wonder what, yeah, roughly from that time period, maybe not the time that Luther was living there, but around there, so you can see what the town looked like a little bit. This is what it looks like today from the castle, taken from the castle. Do you notice, as you can see the church there, the big church. Down here is going to be where Luther's parents lived. That's number 1 here. You notice anything that just doesn't look like it belongs? It's got a number by it. Number 2. Weird so that is the museum for Luther's parents' house. So that the house is here, but then the museum. And why the Germans feel compelled to construct their museums in the ugliest form possible, what it appears to me, I don't know, maybe they think it's nice, but it looks like it totally doesn't match anything else in the city. And then maybe that was an error that they did that. I'm not sure. I don't know when this was put up, but it just, this very modern concrete-looking bunker. Here's another angle on it. Well, before that, this is a quote that Luther always referred to himself as from Mansfeld. So this he had said, "I'm born under Mansfeld's jurisdiction, which compels me to love my homeland and the roads." He had dealings with the people from Mansfeld up until the very end of his life. In fact, that's what when he died, he was in that area. He was in Eisleben, the town that he was born in. He died in the same town he was born in. He was there negotiating something with the leaders, I think, of that region. But he always considered himself as from there. So when he enters the university, even though he hadn't lived in Mansfeld since he was like 13 or something like that, he listed his name as from Mansfeld. So that's always considered his homeland. Yeah. But this is now as another picture. So this is that house that his parents lived in, that he grew up in. So from age 1 to about 13 or 14, he lived in this. They lived in this house, I believe, and there's the museum. Nice, huh? In Mansfeld, the school there was, so the church was St. George's Church, and so he went to the parish school. This is what that school looked like, and this one was standing until just recently, until like 2000 or something like that. Like it was not too long ago that the building was standing, but then it had to get torn down, and then they built something over the top of it, and then there's a plaque over it and says this is where Luther first went to school. When did he start? I put on there age 4.5 to 7.5 because that was the range that I saw in books. They don't really know. Matthesius, one of his first biographers, said he went to school when he was old enough to comprehend the instruction, which is. So this idea of everyone going to school at the same age that's within 100 years of us here. That's a very modern thing. The kind of factory model where you put everyone on a conveyor belt and everyone goes through at the same speed. That's not the way school went. You went to school when the most common age that you see is 7. That's usually 7, and they kind of grouped schooling into groups of 7 years. 0 to 7 is at home. 7 to 14 is kind of your preparatory, we call it elementary, grammar school, and preparatory and then 14 on or so was either university or trade, something or other. And so typically around 7, I don't know. I think Luther kind of paints it as a little bit older. I was surprised to hear this was the Schwiebert, his biographer, said most likely 4.5. I think that's I think that's ambitious, although that would suggest that he was ready at an earlier age and pretty bright boy, which we do get the picture that he was. It was a trivial school, which means we always think of the word trivial as like simple. Comes from the trivium, which was the standard for many years of education. The trivium was the 3 ways: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. It was mainly an instruction in language arts, we would call them. But when it's talking about grammar, it's talking about Latin grammar. If you went to school, the language of education was Latin, and so you learned Latin. And so when he was taught, and he writes about this, and he kind of bashes it a little bit, his education, like it was too strict, that they would, punish them. He talks about there was like a chalkboard over the board, up in the front of church, and it had a picture of a wolf on it. So that's how it got its name, the lupus something. And if you got your name on it, just like, I don't know if you had that when you were in school, you get your name on the board. So that's what you get. If you had your name on the board, if you didn't do your work or you weren't prepared or something like that, and the number of times at the end of the week or so, how many times you had on the board, you got beat. Not staying for recess. You got some kind of corporal punishment. Now we look at that and say, oh, that's horrid. Well, it worked, and I think you see that the product of that. Even though he looks back and says that was really harsh, he did learn his stuff. So there's that. Primarily by memorization. They would memorize, they would recite everything, including. So we sometimes have this idea that Luther never saw a Bible. They didn't see a Bible. They didn't have copies of Bibles, but they were regularly hearing it and memorizing it, memorizing the Psalms, singing the Psalms in music. That's how you did. You memorized your all of your conjugations and your declensions of all of your Latin words, and then repeated and learned. Something that we're finding out 500 years later, when people have stopped doing any memorizing, that it kind of keeps us from being able to memorize things, unfortunately. And that actually, it's a pretty good way of learning things, is to memorize them first. And the best age to do that is at the very young, the very young age that they could do that, and then they know. Music. So he learned. They learned the liturgy. Would have sung in the church, the choir from the school attached to the church, sung the liturgy, sung the Psalms. I have on there Aesop's Fables was a standard for the first text that you would study, and it was very multifunctional. It would teach them, because they could read them probably in Latin, so it'd be their language study. But then there was also moral lesson, moral training, and literature. It was a lot of things. He all his life he loved Aesop. So remember that I was talking about when his father died when he was at the Coburg. The other thing that he did to kind of keep himself sane while the princes of Germany were meeting to decide the fate of this Reformation, Luther was working on translating the fables of Aesop into German, I suppose. The church there. Now, this I don't think was the church this church was finished when Luther was there. It was finished shortly after that. I believe he preached there. But this is St. George's Church. Up underneath the pulpit, right here, is this statue of St. George. And this is something I learned as going through this week. So you had in Mansfeld here, they have the church here, and then the school is named St. George too. If you turn the page, just glance under Eisenach, the name of the school, and I suppose maybe the church too, in Eisenach was St. George. And then when he's in Erfurt, the dorm that he lives in or this burst they call it, is also St. George. So all through his youth, all these things are named after St. George. Who's St. George? So we should talk about that. Oh, we got to come back to this. There's my St. George. Well, I guess we'll come to it later. It's somewhere else in the slides. I didn't move that one here. We'll talk about St. George and the dragon. Okay? So, he goes to school there. In the church there also, he did serve. So, as a boy growing up to age 13, he served as an altar server. So, he was there active in the church. When he's 14, he goes to Magdeburg. I already had it there. In Magdeburg in 1497, and he studies with what they call the Brethren of the Common Life, which was a monastic group that comes like out of the Netherlands. It's kind of this pietistic, devotional group of monks, and one of the things that they did was they served as teachers. We don't really know what school he went to in Magdeburg. He was only there a year, or why they sent him there. Because I don't think his parents didn't leave from Mansfeld. They send him away to Magdeburg, and I can't remember how far away that is, to study with them. They must have had some reputation, must have had some money to be able to send him there for a year. But likely whatever school he was a part of had teachers from this Brethren of the Common Life. And there's some influence there. This devotio moderna, a modern devotion, was, it's hard to describe, or I don't really even know. Contemplation on the scriptures, heavy on the imitation of Christ, the forsaking of the world. There's an emphasis on the scriptures and on language. It was a humanistic group, meaning humanism was this movement to redevote themselves to the languages, to the original languages. And so this kind of love of learning, this 1 year, but it had some influence on Luther, his year in Magdeburg. Possibly this is where Luther first sees a Bible. Now, it's not sure. There's this quote at the bottom of the page. This is from the Table Talks. This is people writing down what Luther said at the table. And Veit Dietrich is one of those. But there's multiple different versions of this story. Because they'll have one story that Luther will tell, and they'll write it down differently, or maybe Luther told it differently. So when did he first come across a Bible? I mean, meaning like a full book that he could just look at. He was exposed to the scriptures, especially the lessons that were read, that they learned in school, that they sang. But it talks about when he was a boy. So this one says as a boy. Then there's another version that comes later that says when I was an adolescent or older student. One even says like when he was about 20 is the first time he does this. But he says he happened on a Bible where by chance he read the story concerning the mother of Samuel in the book of Kings, which is actually in Samuel. The book pleased him greatly. He thought that he would be very fortunate if he should ever be able to possess such a book. Shortly afterwards, he bought Apostle. Apostle is a book of sermons, probably for the Sundays of the year. This pleased him greatly because it contained more Gospels than it was customary to teach during the course of the year, mainly the Sunday lections, or not just the Sunday readings, but they would have been going to church in the school multiple times during the week, and they would hear more lessons than even we hear. So he's hearing all these lessons, but he didn't have the whole Bible, so he couldn't see all these other stories that weren't read to them. When he was made a monk, he gave up all his books. A short time before, he had purchased the Corpus Juris. We'll talk about that when he's in Erfurt. And I don't know what other books. He took none of them with him into the monastery except Plautus and Virgil. There the monks gave him a Bible bound in red leather. So he finally got himself a Bible. And my slides got out of order because I got Eisenach here. There's St. George. Well, let's talk about St. George, and then we'll come back to Eisenach. I don't know how these got out of order. So St. George, he is from Lydda, in Palestine, Israel. And he was a Roman soldier. He died about 290 and was apparently martyred. Kind of about all there is to know about him. There's not a long history, not a lot of information. But the legend is connected with St. George is that he slayed a dragon. And it's something to do with this dragon that was terrorizing this town. And they had tried to appease the dragon with who knows whatever, but then eventually they had to send a young maiden every day to the dragon. And there's this young lady that was going to the dragon that day, and he happens upon her and he asks her where she's going. And he, the hero, goes and he says, I'll take the dragon. And he saves her by killing the dragon. So when Luther is hiding out in the Wartburg years later, in 2015, 21, 22, and he disguises himself, he goes by the name Knight George. And I kind of wonder if that has some influence on him. He kind of grew up surrounded by St. George and the legend. And when he's up in the kingdom of the birds, as he calls it, hiding out, right, translating the New Testament, he grows a beard and he goes by Knight George. I need to find. Yeah. I don't know what other picture I'm looking for. Oh, it's the picture of the Bible. Yeah, let's find that. Because I probably put it in Erfurt because some will say, there it is. The idea of enough. There. The idea of a Bible, you ever hear the story? That he finds this Bible and it's chained up. And it's used to say, well, like how awful that they had to chained up the Bible, like they didn't allow people to read it. The way this really looked was that Bibles were really, or books in any case, were very expensive. You can see how big these things are, right? We just talked last week about the printing press. Like this had just been invented within the 100 years, this idea of printed books, but they're still very expensive. And Bibles especially being very big. So the idea of them being chained up, this is basically the reference shelf at the library. Like these books don't leave the library. They're on reference. That's why they're chained up. Because they're expensive, and if you just walk out of the library, they're not easy to replace these things. So he does apparently come across, when this is, so the suggestion, some way is that maybe this was as early as Magdeburg. He said in Erfurt, when he was at the university, students were not just allowed to go in, like when they had an off hour, to go into the library and just look at a book. They had to, if you went into the library, you had to go in the company of a teacher. And it was very regulated about what. So perhaps with the Brethren of the Common Life, if he was able to find a copy of the Bible there. All right. Now, Eisenach. So he goes to school in Eisenach. Again, not sure why he goes there. Probably as his father's being a little more well-to-do. He does his first years in Mansfeld, spends a year in Magdeburg. The school there in Eisenach was known as a very good school. So it probably has something to do with that. One thing interesting about Eisenach. So the Wartburg, where I was just talking about, Luther's Kingdom of the Birds, where he's hidden away and he goes as Knight George. That's it right up there. See it? That's the castle. So it's over the city, kind of like Mansfeld had a castle over it. The Wartburg is up on the hill or mountain over the city of Eisenach. Goes there in 1498. Again, the church there is the Church of St. George. And so that's where I had stuck in St. George. Now I'm going to click through here. And now the place where he lived, so the Katas and the Shalbs. If you ever heard of him, talk about Luther singing for his supper or singing for something and some woman gives him a place to stay or something like that because she loved to hear him sing. It's not entirely clear what that story, how much of that is true. Luther does talk about singing and being a poor student here in his sermon there. So they did go around singing, but this family, Frau Kata, was the wife of a well-to-do citizen of the town. His wife then was a Schaub. She was another well-to-do family in the city, and pretty sure that Luther then stayed with this family while he was there at school in Eisenach. He would walk one of their little kids to school. He maybe tutored one of the kids in that household. And this is the house in Eisenach where they lived. The school there, and there's a picture of him. And the idea of them singing, going around and singing, wasn't necessarily like they were too poor, but it was maybe just a thing that they did. And it was I don't know, a fundraising tour for the school, and they all went along. Even if by this time Luther's dad is doing pretty decent, so it wasn't as though. And he talks about that. There was a time, he says, when my beloved father supported me at the University of Erfurt with all love and self-sacrifice, but still I was for a time a poverty student. And according to this psalm, I have risen by the pen to a position which I would not exchange for that of the Turkish Sultan, taking his wealth and giving up my learning. So it talks about him going from door to door begging for bread. Not exactly sure what that looked like or if that, So the school there, this is not the school that he attended, it's the parish school, but it was at one time next to the church, destroyed. I think this one might have said it was destroyed in, don't know when it was, from 1531. So actually quite a long time. So this is the school, though, that Bach went to, though. So they went to the same school, but it probably wasn't the same building anymore. So the Eisenach is where Bach was born. And so this school that is functionally the same, but it's a different building than Luther went to. Bach did go to the same school in this town. So they have another museum. See another building? Is that so? They got the house that Bach grew up in, and next to them this monstrosity that is the museum. Funny to me. Here's the church there. The school, like in Mansfeld, is a classical trivium school. Now he's older, and so he's going to be further in. He is going to be reading the classics. I don't know that he learned Greek yet. I think that came later at the monastery, but he was certainly reading the classics in Latin, writing in Latin, composing, writing poetry, studying still Aesop's fables, even at this older age. They never kind of really get past that. It's kind of a fundamental text for them. You can see the quote from Philip Melanchthon, his co-worker later on, when he's talking about in Eisenach. He rounded out his Latin studies, and since he had a penetrating mind and rich gifts of expression, he soon outstripped his companions in eloquence, languages, and poetic verse. So that in 1521, he then enrolls in the University of Erfurt, one of the earliest universities. We talked about that in the Middle Ages, the development of the university, and he enrolls there. Spring, I want to say maybe I read May or so, 1521. That's kind of significant because you see that by the time it's September rolls around of the next year in 1502, he's got his bachelor's degree. Here's something interesting about like the classical education. What it did is it drilled them so well in the early years. By the time they got up to this level, this kind of studying was kind of a piece of cake. What you hear about, so this is a Bachelor of Arts. Arts, we think of as arts. I know this came up when we were going through Middle Ages and talked about the universities. We think of the arts and we think of like the fine arts. When they talk about a Bachelor of Arts, arts means skills. The arts of grammar, logic, rhetoric, these were the skills that a free man needed. The ability to think, to write, read, to express oneself, that you learned that's what school did. So that you could study the sciences. So when you say arts and sciences, arts were the preliminary trivial arts, and then the quadrivium arts. There were a set of three and a set of four. The three were grammar, rhetoric, and logic. The four was math, music, I should know, astronomy, and those were the scientific arts. It could be geometry. So it's this. You did language, and then the rest of them were kind of numbers. So obviously math is numbers, but like music is numbers in time. They studied music as a math. So you studied the mechanics of it, and it's how number goes in time, but then number in space. If geometry was one, I don't know. The astronomy is studying the stars and it's space and time and all these things. That was part of the arts. That was all part of the arts and a liberal arts. Liberal doesn't mean how we sometimes use it. Liberal means free, and the liberal arts were the skills needed to be a free person, which would also still be useful today. And I think the reason why a movement of classical education, of going back to that, rather than the servile arts were the other kind of arts. Servile arts were what servants needed to learn. That was just bare skills. So, Bachelor of Arts. So he can do that in, like less than 18 months. He gets his Bachelor of Arts. And in there, the 30 out of 57, that's out of his class. He was 30 out of 57, kind of in the middle here, right? I don't know if he sloughed off those first years. The first year, maybe did it. That was the minimum. So that time that he did, that was the minimum amount of time that you could do it in. You had to spend that much time. A bachelor's degree was what allowed you to continue your studies. It was a stepping stone. But then once you had that, you could help to teach, I think. Whereas a master teacher, one with a master's degree, was when you've completed and you were now a magister, able to teach. Where he lived in Leipzig, so there's the city with the church. This is what's called the Bursa of St. George, kind of like is a dormitory. That's where he lived, but then you lived with a master, and it was all divided up. So you only had a few students per teacher that was assigned to that house, and they did everything together. And I think Erfurt at the time was a city of about 20,000, pretty big city, about 2,000 students at the university. And so he was in this St. George house through this whole time, through his bachelor's and his master's degree. And then he gets his master's in 1505, so just a couple more years. And now he's the second out of his class of 17. So when it says then so this is the place he lived. Then across the street is what is it called? The St. Michaelstrasse. That's the city. The main college that he was a part of. So his dorm was right across the street there. This building was destroyed and was rebuilt. It was destroyed in 1945, you might guess, and then rebuilt entirely across the street. Okay. So then when it says began to study law, so when we said that he had the arts and the sciences, the arts, his Bachelor of Arts, his Master of Arts, then the sciences were things, we think of science kind of as this narrow, like science, like we think of physical science. Sciences were any body of knowledge, a thing that you studied, like law, like theology. So there would be a body of knowledge that you would study when you went and studied the sciences. So this wasn't a thing, we sort of think of, you've got like a college of the arts and then a college of science, and where you have different degrees. You have arts degrees and science degrees. The way this worked is that one was a stepping stone to the other. The arts allowed you then the ability to be able to study. And so his father was pretty strongly in favor of him going in to study law, to be a lawyer, which would have been helpful to him in his businesses, I would imagine. And he does start this Corpus Juris Civilis. Luther mentions that although or no, Dietrich mentions this in the table talk. He says he had purchased it. Most things that I've read was that he got this as a gift from his father, which was an expensive volume. I don't know if it was a single volume thing or what, or a set, but an expensive. This was the corpus, body, means body of law, of civil law. So it's this big law textbook that was probably standard for that study, and his father apparently had purchased this for him. That's going to be when next step is when he enters the monastery, and he sells that because he's giving that up, and he's going to study. He's going to become a monk, and so his father was a bit disappointed with him. It's very interesting to read the letters because until his father died, he continues in contact with his father, and his father was disappointed in this, but he have letters that he continued to write to him, and he eventually did, I think, appreciate what Luther ended up doing, but he wasn't so happy at the time. One interesting story from this time period, when 1503, Easter, 1503. So this is after he's got his master, or after he's got his bachelor's. He's going back home for Easter, and he cuts his leg with his sword. He cuts his leg and cuts an artery in his leg. Not good. Almost bled out until they could get a doctor to stitch him up. And that's the kind of one that's referred to. And I think there's some. He must tell the story that at that time he had prayed to Mary to help him in that trial, which sounds a little bit like this next stretch when Luther's going to be, I think, also on his way home, or maybe on his way back to school during this time, and he gets caught in a thunderstorm and is afraid he's going to die. And this is apparently on the site where they think that this maybe took place, somewhere along there, and they got this stone up that says, "Help me, Saint Anne, I will become a monk." So he makes this vow that if Saint Anne would help him, that he would become a monk, which is in 1505, I believe. What else? That's all I have on this. That's all this. If you want to look on the timeline, you've got a ton of stuff, extra stuff, and it's more for your reference. We're not going to go through, because I really don't think we need to talk about when the first lead pencils were used or when toothpaste was invented. But it's on there just for your reference, just to see. I think maybe it's helpful. You kind of put some things into context. So like the same year that Luther is born, also Raphael, the artist, is also born that same year. Nicholas Amsdorff, Ulrich Zwingli the next year. So maybe that's helpful. You also, like 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's on here. So that's, when Luther's a boy. It's so this doing this section of history is very different than the previous section, because there's so much material. So for me to find Luther quotes, I've got a whole set of books that could be used. I kind of filter through and what might be useful for us to get a sense of what we'll do next is going through Luther's time in the monastery up until like the 95 Theses. So we'll cover these next 12 years in our next section. Luther, the authors, some authors, historians, they'll get crazy with ideas and try to find things in Luther's, like they try to find from his tales of the school, like the trauma that he experienced by being beaten by his teachers, and how that came out later in his life, or maybe there's some sort of like sexual repression or something like that, or something that made him fixate on. And Luther does fixate in a sense, like he's kind of got a dirty mouth a little bit. He's kind of his language is colorful. Like I was just, I showed Sarah this when I was reading. I was just skimming through letters. I was looking for references to Mansfeld. He's got a letter to his wife from home, and he talks about some beer that he found in the town that he was staying in. He says, "This is like the Mansfeld beer that you were telling me about." And he says, "It pleases me well and gives me 3 bowel movements within the first couple of hours of the day." Like, is that good? I don't know. But like, I guess, it seems like it might be too much information even for a letter to your wife. I meant to look that up. I don't hear any reference to siblings. So I'll look that up and see if I can track that down. Yeah, I never see reference to siblings, but I meant to. I had that same question that I not heard. You know, when reading the books, like you'd hear if he was, you hear that his father had 3 brothers, and yeah. So I'm gonna guess that maybe that is the case, just because I don't recall ever hearing about his brothers or sisters.
It's interesting to see that the Da Vinci studied the Last Supper, so that would have been he was 12. To see that era of time with that.
So when you think about the Renaissance, kind of this revival of both art and other learning to sciences, that is part of this time. And so it's a happening place to be, like in Germany especially, but all over Europe. Discoveries. Yeah. I think it's fascinating to find out that like Luther and Bach went to the same, grade school. They have more records I've read. They know what books, for example, that Bach used to learn Latin. The curriculum was very much the same. Well, it's generally the same, but like the book that he used was written by Philip Melanchthon when Bach went to school. The grammar or the logic book that he used. Like they have those records still, which is kind of neat. And you can kind of understand. But Luther's ability to write, for sure, but just to comprehend the language, you can see it was well formed in his education. While he, like I said, he complains about it. He complains about how hard it was. But then I'm like, I see what it produced. And so I'm not gonna, that must have been, like you say, that must have been hard. But I think maybe it made you into what you are. And Luther certainly had a lot of writing to do later on about, and used his upbringing to kind of correct in some of the, but I think that like that wolf board, the lupus board that they had, I think they just got called that because it had a picture of a wolf on the board. They still use that after Luther's day. So it didn't go away. The kind of corporal punishment for and the form of the education. Luther doesn't change in the education. He makes use of that classical liberal arts education. They reform it. He does advocate for a wider audience. He writes sermons and writes letters to princes and tell them that they need to make these schools available for everyone. He's oftentimes either credited or criticized for creating the public school. That is, having the government establish the schools. Of course, when he's doing that, he's writing to Lutheran princes and says, as the kind of the chief member of the church, as the prince of the territory, you have a responsibility to help make sure that this happens. And it does some amazing work. But then sometimes, and even like compulsory education, like he's either criticize or get credit for that too. I think what it's come to today is a little bit different, also because government has changed and we're in a different world. now, but the idea that everyone, so they had, and even then, even after Luther, the schools, the Latin schools typically were just for boys. I didn't mention that. The schools that he attended, they would have all been boys. And the Lutherans do start girls' schools. But they're, until, I don't even know when, until who knows when, schools were always segregated, which I think there was some wisdom to that. Even to the point, think like Little House on the Prairie, watching that. Girls on one side, boys on the other. They were together, but there was a reason for that, because they're different. So we're learning something, that boys are different from girls. and that includes how they learn. And the girls' schools, like this is after Luther's time, or as a result of this, sometimes those were German schools. So they didn't necessarily learn all the Latin because they weren't going into those professions. But they knew how to read. They would sing. They learned things that they would need to know, and they probably wasn't as long of a period, but they established them. They found it useful. Yeah. And it was the German schools, the girls' schools, that you could, one author credits that for the Reformation continuing and surviving, because one of the things that the girls learned in school were hymns. And the way that those hymns got passed down, past the girls that learned them, is the girls were singing them to their children and their grandchildren. And that was a very effective way of passing on the faith from one generation to the next. And because they had learned those in the schools, that when pastors weren't out, even times in the Counter-Reformation, this comes later on, we'll get to that, but when they'll kick the Lutheran pastors out, they can't have a Lutheran pastor anymore. They can't have Lutheran services anymore, but they still had their hymns, and they could keep those. And if someone happened to gather outside the window as a woman was singing while she's doing something, and people happened to listen, what could you do? That those schools helped to pass that faith on. Shall we close with doxology?